Melbourne's Port Phillip Bay has long been Sydney Harbour's ugly stepsister. That probably won't change, but historian Professor Geoffrey Blaney says Australia owes much to its largest and busiest cargo port. An exhibition at Melbourne's Mornington Peninsula Gallery pays tribute to the bay and the great waves of settlers who arrived by sailing ship to build a new nation. Greg Hoy reports.
So much of Australian history has taken place in the ships coming in Port Phillip heads and sailing up the bay to Melbourne. It's not widely known historically.
Port Phillip Bay was the gateway for so many people who chose to come to Australia. All our forebears were boat people.
When they first sailed in the bay, it was very beautiful.
Penny Blaisley thinks her historic Heronswood house overlooking Port Phillip Bay may be haunted. After all, alive with characters, her family's local history dates back 6 generations to a colourful English migrant who arrived in 1839 called Wilbraham Liarde, the father of Port Melbourne. Pioneer sheep farmer, hotelier, musician and importantly an artist who recorded with pencil or paintbrush his first impressions around the bustling bay of Port Phillip.
When he arrived in Port Melbourne, he found the port so busy and wonderful with all the boats in it. He was absolutely bowled over, and so he loved the climate. He found it very interesting, all the people. There were peoples from nationalities all around the world, and it was partly because they were all trading. There was a corroboree at Emerald Hill, which later became South Melbourne.
And Melbourne's Mornington Peninsula is alive with such art and oral histories.
My maternal forebears all came out here in the 1840s, 1850s or 1860s. The one thing they had in common was they were searching for a better life.
The Sea of Dreams is a rare collection of historic paintings and records assembled by Mornington Regional Gallery, including many artists who went on to achieve great fame nationally and internationally. It tells the tall-masted tale of the armada of free settlers who fled the British Isles and Europe from the 1830s, risking their lives on a treacherous voyage down under.
Many of their works of art about Port Phillip Bay, whether 150 years ago or 100 years ago, will not have been seen by members of the general public.
The only way I think that anybody would survive that journey was to have a dream.
Shipboard diaries tell of great hardships on the high seas, fear of yellow fever, a child lost overboard, the tempests, the siren call of the shipwrecked coasts that kept lighthouse keepers and rescue boats busy.
So I can only imagine the fear of people on board those ships knowing that the ship was going to go down.
It was on such a sailing vessel that my paternal great-grandparents arrived in the 1800s, and it was a hazardous journey. For those who did make it round the wild weather of Cape Horn, followed by a very big iceberg belt, and then the hazardous Bass Strait Islands, and then the treacherous entrance to the bay, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a bigger harbour than any other in the British Isles, which in turn was surrounded by a vast and fertile hinterland. It was very much the dream come true.
When they came in, they were amazed at the size. They couldn't see from one side to the other, basically.
If you put a 150 kilometre radius around Sydney and a 150 kilometre radius around Melbourne, the amount of grassland for sheep, the amount of gold, Melbourne is far better served than Sydney, so that Melbourne was really very close to great natural resources.
Then, around 1850, as fortune would have it, the Port of Melbourne struck a great golden era.
Port Phillip Bay was the gateway to the goldfields. Melbourne becomes not only the great port in Australia, but the biggest city in Australia, and remained the big city for half a century. Well, of course, being the biggest city, it depended heavily on the port.
With gold surging through its veins, the Port of Melbourne grew fast and grew affluent. Day trippers and holiday makers would flock by paddle steamer to visit bayside beauty spots like Queenscliff, Williamstown, Geelong and Sorrento and Portsea.
So that round Port Phillip Bay, there were more important tourist resorts, small by today's standards, than any other bay, any other harbour in Australia.
Today, Port Phillip Bay remains Australia's busiest cargo port. While Sydney's scenic harbour covers 54 kilometres of water, Port Phillip Bay covers 1,930 square kilometres and retains its allure. Around its foreshores, Melbourne's metropolis and satellite settlements have grown to house 4.5 million people and growing fast.
Melbourne at the moment is growing at a faster percentage in population than is Sydney. The danger is that Melbourne will become just one huge suburb, and that huge suburb will creep right round the shores of Port Phillip Bay.
I think we're incredibly fortunate to live here. I think we're probably the luckiest people in the world almost living here.
And I hope that that continues into the future and we just don't consume ourselves in a way, because there's so many of us and we're not mindful of the fragility of our bay.
That report from Greg Hoy, and that's the program for tonight.